Yeah, I was surprised over the 70 years that there wasn't talk about it. Like I said, it was a bit hushed up.
They were out of their league, those vehicles. Should not have been there.
There was all hell breaking loose. Flares going up and the lot.
In the early 1950s, Australia was on high alert. The Korean War had shown how quickly conflict could reach the region, and national service became a key part of strengthening the country's defences. The National Service Act 1951 meant that Australian men turning 18 on or after November 1st, 1950 were called up and required to complete 98 days of continuous recruit training, followed by 14-day camps twice a year and 14 days part-time parades over 2 years. They were then obligated to complete 78 days of training in the Citizens Military Forces, commonly referred to as the CMF, over 3 years. In Newcastle, many national servicemen were stationed with Citizens Military Forces troops at Camp Shortland. This camp housed the 15th Northern River Lancers, an armoured regiment, and the 16th Transport Company of the Royal Australian Army Service Corps, together forming the only amphibious unit in the Commonwealth. Their job was to operate and maintain the Army's small but important fleet of amphibious vehicles. Training revolved around 3 wartime machines: the LVT-4 troop carrier, the turret-equipped LVT-A4, and the 6-wheel duck. They had been built fast during the Pacific Campaign and were still being pushed hard in exercises along the New South Wales coast. Operations often began at Camp Shortland, with convoys running through the harbour and up the long stretch of Stockton Bight. For locals, the camp was a familiar presence. Libby Maskey, daughter of Lieutenant Peter Langwell, remembers being taken through as a child.
So we'd always drive up to the gates, and Dad would always salute and would drive in. If I could draw, I can still see the huts around, and would drive. It was like a circle, but we'd drive around, and Dad would point out the different things, the mess and everything. But it was just, to me, it was like tin and fibro. Yeah, but it was sort of all very saluting and all the rest of it.
On Sunday, March the 7th, 1954, 184 young national servicemen and CMF troops gathered at Camp Shortland. The plan was straightforward. At 0200 hours, a convoy of 19 amphibious vehicles plus 1 safety workboat would leave Newcastle Harbour in single file, heading for Broughton Island. There, they would camp and train for 2 weeks. This exercise was codenamed Operation Seagull.
We were given briefings by the Colonel about safety, the importance of wearing Mae West life jackets, slightly inflated, so that in the case of emergency we would be able to blow them up fully and easy to rescue. Also to untie our bootlaces so they won't be a hindrance if we need to enter the water.
Through the early hours of the morning, crews checked engines, loaded gear, and climbed aboard their vehicles for departure.
Yeah, and I remember Mum driving me into the camp there early in the morning, around about midnight. We all got all set, ready to go. Someone was slept there, but Mum drove me in.
All the planning was done. The CO's got weather reports. He even went out in his duck and did a recce to see what the sea state was like before he sent them out.
And the Colonel did do that, what he said he did. He went out into the sea, and before we left he came in and said conditions were favourable and it was okay to proceed.
Everyone was in the vehicles and ready to go, and we're going on a trip, this is exciting, and jumped on the tank. That's where they put me on the tank. Never been on one before.
At 2 a.m, the convoy moved out of Camp Shortland and slipped through Newcastle Harbour, one after another, their engines echoing across the water.
By the time they got all 20 vehicles and the Ramey workboat tucked in behind, probably about 1 kilometre long, spread out.
So there's quite a big mass of us actually, by the time we had all the amphibious tags.
and then all the ducks. There's quite a big team.
They're all one after the other, and it looked quite spectacular on the water in the dark.
Captain Sharp said, "Go down and have a look and see if the taillights are on." I said, "What for?" He said, "Oh, we've followed taillights astern." Apparently they meant that the vehicle in front would follow that taillight.
At the time our tank left, a lot of the crew was settled on the floor of the tank as we proceeded up the harbour.
But anyway, they got going and we got out off the heads, or the entrance to Newcastle, and our driver, he said, "Here, will you take over, Warren? I'm a bit sick, I might go down below." So he left me there and he went down on the bench where all the equipment and ammunition was. I'd never been in a tank like that.
The sea was calm at first. Apart from a few men becoming seasick, the convoy seemed to be making steady progress. This calm didn't last long.
But about an hour and a half into the drive, they encountered a change in sea state. Storm blew up.
It's just as we got further along the Stockton Bight that it got rougher and rougher. Eventually I couldn't see the tanks in front, you know. You wouldn't see them for a while and all of a sudden you'd see them, and I was in the front of the tank. The driver one side and me alongside of him the other side, you know. We had a hatch each open and I had mine open most of the night, vomiting.
The first sign of trouble came from an LVT A4 commanded by Corporal Gilbert Hull, positioned fourth from the front of the convoy. His crew reported a catastrophic engine failure, causing the vehicle to lose power and the operation of its water pump.
The motor kept going for a while and then it cut out. Anyway, we had to put a flare up. I've never seen a flare before. We got him up.
All of a sudden there was bloody red flares going everywhere where tanks were getting into trouble.
There was no line of progression that was visible.
There was all hell breaking loose. Flares going up and the lot.
The leader of the whole line was the Colonel James, Jack James. Now he was up the front in the duck, and my mate, who I went to school with, was driving the duck. And they came back and proceeded all night to take us in tow, but we kept on breaking the stir ropes with that round. But it was highly dangerous with stir rope. When the two vehicles went apart, dreadful, you know.
As Corporal Hull's tank was taken under tow, two more vehicles reported similar problems and fired distress flares. Lieutenant Walters later recalled that
the engine cut out at 0400 hours. We wallowed around. The distress signal was given, and the order given to prepare to abandon.
As the vehicle began to sink stern first, he radioed that he was abandoning ship and gave the order for his crew to jump clear. Kevin Newman remembers the experience clearly.
We ended up right out at sea, and the big wave come out the back of it. I was on the back of it, and the big wave, you look up, all the wave was behind us, and we went straight down nose first. And it just went straight under.
The crew were left struggling in the cold, dark seas, and they wouldn't be the only ones that night.
Tanks, ducks, troop carriers getting swamped and sinking.
Only moments after Kevin and his crew were thrown in the sea, a duck commanded by Corporal Wyborn also sank. Both crews, from Walter's tank and Wyborn's duck, were eventually rescued by Sergeant Harry James, whose troop carrier already held a full crew, including the then 21-year-old John Morrow.
Sergeant James instructed me to sit up the front and to help those on that needed it. After they were hauled on board, Harry Stewart, he was in the tank and his job was to count the number of victims that we'd hauled in. Harry told me that he counted 12. After we'd secured all of those in positions, a duck appeared in front of us, and there was some conversation between the captain of the duck, whom I believe to be Colonel James, and Sergeant James, who I believe were relatives. And on that duck there were men standing on the side, and also a small boy.
I don't know whether you heard it before, but I always thought there was a conspiracy. Like, why would he have his kid up there? And it was hushed up for quite a while.
Aboard the duck leading the convoy was 11-year-old Peter James, son of Lieutenant Colonel Jack James.
Yeah, maybe he shouldn't have been there, but he was sort of his dad's Batman.
Further up the line, Kevin Sants was aboard an LVTA-4 under the command of Sergeant John Sharp, where it too ran into trouble.
When we could see there was something going on, we all piled up on top there, so we could, if anything went wrong, we could get out.
When attempting to change down from second gear into third, my motor cut out. I tried to start, but it would not. After about 15 minutes, I sent up a red flare, which was investigated by Captain Sharp in a duck. Captain Sharp threw a tow line aboard, but on repeated occasions the tow line snapped. Captain Sharp then went away to make radio communication to get further assistance out to me. During the time he was away, a heavy southerly blew up and a breaker hit the vehicle, washing me overboard.
This wave, you could see it coming. I was looking behind me, and I could see these waves building up, one up the other, like you do in a surf. And I yelled out, geez, it comes a wave. But anyway, surveyed on top of us.
Next thing I knew, all the crew members were in the water with me, and we joined hands according to standard drill for abandoning vehicle.
They all formed hands and stayed in a group. If you're one group, you can be rescued. But if you float away, you don't know where you are.
And of course, when we went at the water, I had boots on, and I had all the gear that you wear, And I was one of the lucky ones because I could swim, but I managed to get the boots off, and I got it to shore. But see what happened, we're covered in dieseline and oil that came out of the sumps of the tanks when they sank. That wasn't a good place to be.
They were really lucky that a lot of the guys that were in the unit were surf lifesavers themselves, but they were unfortunate there were non-swimmers in the unit. Luckily the guys that were surf lifesavers kept the others going, even when they got to the beach and the Surf Lifesaving Club from Stockton was called in to help. Our guys kept going back in and pulling people out and helping resuscitate them.
On the break of sunrise, an LVT-4 troop carrier, commanded by Sergeant William Grazier, was running low on engine oil. Worried they wouldn't last the full journey, he turned toward the beach, estimating the run to shore would take roughly an hour.
About 5:45, I noticed that the oil gauge of the vehicle was fluctuating, and I instructed Corporal Neve to get the can of oil and put it in the oil reservoir. I put in 4 gallons of oil and it took the lot. I did not want the crew to be left 1.5 miles offshore with a seized motor and a refrigerator on board.
Meanwhile, Corporal Hull's disabled vehicle remained under tow behind Colonel James's duck.
And because the A4s and the 4s didn't have a great freeboard and they were very heavy, they became a lead cork, if you like.
So we were getting lower and lower, and the sea was splashing over and going down the turret. I said, we're going down shortly and we're going to take them with us. It wasn't too long and that's what happened. And I just said to the boys, jump clear, as far as you can. Our tank went down like a lead balloon, I can tell you. It's only seconds. And she went down. I remember Richo driving the duck. He was about 30 foot in the air with a steering wheel in his hand in a duck going down.
The drum master of the pipe band, Terry Holmes, he was with James on the duck. They wore greatcoats in them days, big, long, down to the ankles, heavy as lead. His duck went down. Luckily, they brought him up to the surface and saved his life.
The ducks were there as safety vehicles for the unit primarily. Their job was to try and tow these guys out. But when you put probably in excess of 12 tonne in vehicle, plus all the water that was in them behind the duck. It pulled a couple of the ducks down and they sank as well.
The crew of Corporal Hull's tank were left fighting the current and fatigue in a life-threatening situation.
We broke up a lot. It was sad out there when you think about it, and when you're going down and you're not sure whether you're going to come up, you know. I had a few of them, but I was lucky I was strong and a good swimmer. And I don't know how long I was in the water, floundering around for an hour or more or two, I don't know. But I know it was something I never want to go through again. You find yourself, you're doing a supposed to be enjoyable training trip and you were crying, you were praying, you know. It wasn't good. But I'm here.
Several survivors later recalled sharks moving through the area, another fear they had to contend with as they battled the dark seas.
There was flashes in the water and it could have been anything doing it. Hard to say what was causing it. See, the Stockton Bight's renowned for white pointer sharks all through there.
It's amazing being in Stockton Bight because we know that the sharks and it's not a good place for anything to happen.
As crews from these two vehicles finally made it ashore, it became clear that not all had made it to dry land.
But when I got on the beach, Jack James was laying on his back and he said, "Anyone seen Peter?" He said, "I can't go home without him." And that's when Alf Finney said, "I think I can see him popping up out in the surf," and he went out and he got him. Alf got a medal, but it was never defined who he saved. That's why we were gagged, because Peter shouldn't have been there. When the seas came up, they were out of their league, those vehicles. Should not have been there.
The ones that kept going sort of saw the problems that they were having, so they started to try and come into the beach and land. But with the sea state as it was, the waves were too big and there was just, some of them come up on their nose and flipped over and broached sideways and just tipped everybody in the drink. Would have been terrifying for them, really would.
Sergeant William Grazier's vehicle was only minutes from shore when disaster struck.
I came in as close as I could to the breakers to see if I could find a good landing place. I decided to land and told Sergeant Hancock to make his way onto the beach and keep his eye on a landmark. The first wave that hit us from the rear lifted us up and rode past us. The second one lifted the vehicle right up at the stern until we must have been at an angle of 75 degrees. The vehicle then nose-dived into the water. On arrival at the beach, I checked up the personnel that were there, and we found Sergeant Hancock, Trooper Blackie and Trooper Dixon were missing. We went down on the beach in a southerly direction and saw Hancock come out of the surf, and the other crew, who were further down the beach, found Trooper Dixon. He was lying in the shallow water, supported by his life preserver and unconscious. A short while later, Captain MacDonald arrived in his duck, and I reported to him that Blackie was missing, and he took over the search. I went back and had a look at Hancock and Dixon. Artificial respiration was being applied to them. I and the fit members of the crew continued looking for Blackie.
He was in an LVT sort of carrier that had our fridge and all our food, a lot of stuff in there. And we assumed that it capsized and he got caught in it and went down and never come back. He was a champion soccer player from Westmore. Eh?
Not long after 20-year-old Robert Blackie was last seen alive, Sergeant Don McHatty's tank began to fail. The engine flooded, the pumps stopped, and within 10 minutes the tank went under, leaving the crew fighting against the current miles offshore.
Filled up with water and dropped like a stone. Just boom.
Around the same time, Lieutenant William Pye's LVTA-4 suffered a critical engine failure. The vehicle was still afloat, but slowly taking on water.
The Caddy's crew were picked up by the vehicle commanded by Corporal Gibson. A little later, as Lieutenant Pye's vehicle started to ship water, he decided to transfer his crew to Gibson's vehicle, which then had the complement of 3 vehicles. 30 men were now aboard.
With the lieutenant's men transferred directly across, their vehicle was left adrift in the swell. Trooper Stan Wilmot, one of Lieutenant Pye's crew, later recalled the shock of leaving their failed vehicle and trusting their lives to another tank already at operational capacity.
Motor cut out. Once it cuts out, your water pump stopped working. So another tank came along and picked us up.
Gibson's vehicle now carried 30 men, far more than the vehicle was ever designed for. Noel Gibson and his driver, Trooper H. Moran, steered their overloaded vehicle towards the beach. Ron Gibbs, just 20 years old at the time, was one of the men packed aboard, surrounded by exhausted soldiers who had already been through one sinking.
Probably looking at a swell as high as that ceiling out on the bank where they were breaking.
Just we hit the waves, it just picked us up and we just got thrown into the water. And eventually we made it to the beach, you know. But it was pretty rough because we had life jackets on. But the wave would pick you up and take you in, and the backwash would come and drag you out, you know. And that was the hardest part.
When they reached shore, those who could stand immediately began pulling others from the surf, some barely conscious.
Well, I started helping the blokes that were in the water out. Some of them couldn't swim. Well, a lot couldn't swim. So nearly everyone that'd been in the tanks had to be rescued in one way or another. And I was one of the only swimmers there anyhow. You just had to do what you could do. As soon as you got a bloke out that it was shallow enough to get his feet on the ground, the others would help him that hadn't been in the water as long. And the last bloke that I got out, he was unconscious. And so I started pumping him, and they brought a doctor from, I think, Nelson's Bay or somewhere. They got him along the beach. He checked to see if he had any pulse, and he couldn't find any pulse. And he said, "You can give up."
Despite Ron's efforts, 28-year-old Noel Bluey Moran was pronounced dead, with his younger brother watching helplessly from a distance.
While they were trying to revive his brother, he was walking off and be across the road, you know, up and down. He wouldn't come near him. He just kept walking up and down with his head in his hand. And mate, I wouldn't know where they got the blue from, because when I saw him, he was dead, his whole body was bright blue, you know. It was a heck of a night. Sorry. Something I want to do again. But anyway, I'm still here.
Nearby, 20-year-old Michael Mornament was also receiving resuscitation, but sadly could not be revived. Lieutenant William Pye later recorded that both men were worked on for over an hour before the doctor reached the scene and formally declared them deceased. Although 3 had died, many others were saved because of the brave efforts of those that could assist.
One bloke that I remember could swim was Donnie McCaddy.
He went back apparently 4 or 5 times through the high seas to get people out. But he's not the only one. Some of the surf life saving guys, again, went back 3 or 4 times to get people out, 200 metres out in rips, pulling people out. And they never got recognised sufficiently, I don't think.
While dozens of men were fighting through white water on the beach, others were still at sea. With radios waterlogged and visibility low, several crews had no choice but to continue on their original course, hoping they could reach land before their vehicles failed.
We saw another tank, an LVT-4A, just floating in the ocean.
This vehicle was the tank abandoned by William Pye's crew some hours earlier.
So Sergeant James
instructed me to get up on the front of ours and jump over onto the floating tank and assess the situation. We couldn't leave the tank bobbing around in the ocean, we would take it in tow. So with me on the floating tank, we proceeded to tow the vehicle. Unfortunately, as our vehicle with two crews on board, as they were going down the wave, I was coming up the wave on the towed tank, and the big hemp tow rope snapped under tension and it flew back and landed in my lap. Sergeant James then made the decision to get out our 85-ton steel hawser and hook onto both tanks and continue the tow. He also had Harry Stewart get out the axe and for me to sit on the front of the towed tank with an axe in hand, and if that tank happened to sink, try and cut the steel tow rope. We were able to tow the tank until we reached about 200 metres from the shore at Morna Point. Harry Stewart also came over onto my tank. Sergeant James then instructed me to unhook the tow rope and he would take the crews in. As soon as he hit the breaker line, the tank skewed partially side on, and I thought, oh, they'll tip for sure, but Sergeant James skillfully managed to straighten it, and I watched him head to the beach, exit the beach successfully and climb up the hill and take our crews away. Harry Stewart and I stayed sitting on the floating tank, and I said to Harry Stewart, I wonder if there's anything to eat. So I climbed back inside the tank and found a packet of biscuits, and we had a biscuit each, and just as we'd finished that, a wave came over the top and washed us into the sea. With that, we both swam back and climbed back on board. Harry Stewart said, look what I've found, and he picked the packet of biscuits up and held it aloft, and the second wave came over the top, and we were on our way to the beach in the whitewash, and that was traumatic, to say the least. The May West jackets, the worst thing I think I've ever experienced in white water. The suction and the strength of the push in those waves held your face down in the water. I managed to get me head up and look to see where Harry was, and I could see him with his arm up signalling distress, but I couldn't get to him. So head down again, a bit further onto the beach, and I looked up again, and he's inert in the water and trying to lift his hand. There's nothing I could do about it to assist him until I got to the beach, and I ran along the beach and went in to assist him onto the shore, and with that it was his last maximum effort and he just collapsed on the sand. People came down from, they said, Gan, and they took Harry Stewart away.
With more than half of the amphibious vehicles either sinking or disabled, others considered themselves fortunate to have reached land at all. Glanmore Wilcox, then a young national serviceman, recalls his night aboard a Duck.
The seas were pretty big, and I've been running surf boats all my life. And I looked behind at this wave. It was like a telegraph pole. And I'm hanging onto the bows of the Duck, the bows of the part that hold the canopy on. Captain Sharp says, what are you doing? I said, well, I've been in surf boats, and if you're going to turn over, you stay with the boat, because if you get thrown out, that boat's going to come at you. So it went in and it picked the Duck up, due on 45, and I thought, here goes, slid down, and she come straight out and up on the beach, just to the water. And then we went down the beach to see what else was available. It was just like a battlefield. There's people everywhere.
Clarence Taylor was on an LVTA-4 and vividly recalls his experience that night.
Tank was coming in like that with the waves underneath it. You were expected to topple over any minute, but We made the shore.
With some of the damaged vehicles beached, troops were ordered to stand guard until recovery teams could reach the area.
There were 2 or 3 houses visible from our position, and during the morning they brought over a can of milk and some food because we had had nothing to eat by that time, and we were very thankful. Later on, Sergeant James came down for a brief period and we were all on the tank and we were photographed. And we were photographed holding the steel hawser up, which split and splintered in the effort to pull that tank with a lot of water in it up onto the headland.
In the days following the disaster, search parties combed the beach looking for any sign of Robert Blackie, who was still missing.
The next morning, the duck was refuelled and we entered the beach at Porter Point. We followed the beach all round to Stockton to do the beach search for Blackie.
One walked down the water's edge, and one of us walked up to the high water mark, you know, and we swapped over, but we walked all the way to Morner Point looking for a body, but we never found it.
Blackie's death hit his mates hard. Warren, who had completed his National Service training with Robert, remembers their last conversation whilst he was seeking out a new life jacket in the early hours of March the 8th, a moment that has stuck with him for more than 70 years.
He was sitting on this side of this carrier and so we had 98 days. Our beds was beside each other and he said, "Hey, Dean, where you going?" Oh, I said, "I've got to get a new one of these somewhere." And that's about it. He was just sitting on the side, just waiting to go, you know. And that's the last I ever saw of him.
John Morrow, who had played competitive sport with Blackie, recalls his last interaction with the young National Serviceman.
And he said, "Which tank are you in?" And I said, "I'm in this one." And with that he said, "Come and see the tank that I'm in." In the back of the tank there was this huge refrigerator. He said it's stocked full of alcohol for the officers when we get to the camps. And the refrigerator was tied in onto the side of the vehicle with a rope.
Back in Newcastle, families waited anxiously as fragmentary reports arrived. Many didn't know whether their loved ones were alive until hours later.
That's my father up there, World War I, and he had my brother drive him up there to see me still alive.
My girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, she had heard nothing of what had happened to me, and she rang up to find out what the situation was, and whoever she rang said, "Who's asking?" And she said, "It's his mother." And he said, "His mother?" She said she wasn't hopeful of getting any responses, and they said, "Oh, he's all right."
Yeah, I was worried about Mum and Dad. I couldn't get through anywhere to notify them, you know, that I was all right. And I think they rang up the camp and found out that I was all right, you know. But of course there was a big panic on with a lot of the parents at the time, you know, they couldn't find out what was going on.
Because a lot of it, the names weren't released, the details weren't released to the public until they knew what was going on. So families didn't realise what was going on until the guys got taken up to Nelson Bay and they started ringing up saying we're okay, all that sort of thing. Those that didn't get phone calls started asking questions and blaming people and wanting answers, and triggered a lot of media questions.
Kevin Sands was admitted to hospital after the disaster. His father, distressed by the way the operation had been handled, wrote directly to the Minister for the Army. In that letter, he condemned what had happened, describing those in charge as
incompetent men in command of precious young lives.
Dad was well known in Newcastle, and he wanted to know why the Army didn't notify people that that we were in the Air Force Base, you know. He wanted to know why the officials that run the camp were so stupid to go to Borton Island early in the morning, you know. Well, he said, if you lived in Newcastle, you'd understand the way that Stockton Bight is, you know. It changes with the conditions up there.
Warren recalls an interaction with Army officials after the incident.
We got briefed down at the front of the picture show. Another time they came to my place and give me another little reminder.
In the weeks that followed, serious questions were raised about the use of ageing World War II era vehicles in rough sea conditions. Mechanical failures, maintenance standards, and the decision to send them out in a rising swell were all scrutinised in internal reports and in later court cases.
They were good vehicles during the war, but they were used probably in them big landing barges, you know. They put the end down right on the shallow water and then straight ashore.
You needed to appreciate that they were sinkable, and with the right bad conditions and that, you were at risk, you know.
And it was a shame because, you know, if they'd to see blokes all in amphibious units and hardly any could swim, you'd think that'd be compulsory.
Today I wouldn't have went, you know, I'd know better. But anyway, when you're young, you got more of the good life in you, haven't you?
For survivors, the disaster followed them through their lives. As physical scars heal and the war machines sit rusting on the ocean floor, the effects of that night's trauma can be felt just as strongly 70 years on.
I've never been in the water since.
Since that night?
No, not in the sea, no.
It would have given them nightmares for years, and some of them did. And PTSD's had many names over the years. Shell shock in World War I and World War II, all sorts of things, but nobody treated it as a problem.
Whenever Dad was traumatised, or even after an operation, I remember after his open heart surgery and he was like hallucinating, he always went back, and Mum used to say, you know, he's talking about that night. It was quite a trauma in his life. He spoke proudly about that so many came back, but devastating about his mates.
And I don't want to bring it up. I've had enough. I lost a lot of sleep, you know, and which you do. But we didn't say too much about it. It was all hushed. There was no discussion, but I think at the time the officers were happy to keep it quiet, you know.
Yeah, I was surprised over the 70 years that there wasn't talk about it. Like I said, it was a bit hushed up.
In the months following the tragic incident, the Army conducted several inquiries to determine how a standard training operation could go so horribly wrong.
Once the inquiries started, they were in camera, they were closed inquiries from the Army's point of view. The public wasn't allowed in to ask questions. Eventually, when the coroner's inquiry happened, that's when the families got an opportunity to ask questions and got answers as best we could give them, because the unit didn't really have any control of the situation. It was just bad luck, and that's what both inquiries and the coroner's inquiry said, that it was just change in sea state and bad luck that it happened.
Acts of bravery were later recognised. Sergeant Don McHattie received the George for his actions in the surf and on the beach. A memorial was created at Camp Shortland to honour everyone involved in Operation Seagull, and Trooper Ron Gibbs' efforts were later acknowledged by Nobby's Surf Club.
They said I was some kind of a hero. I don't know what that means. I don't know I don't. I'll have to look that up. I often think about that.